Hey guys, welcome to the second week of Congress. I actually had recorded this whole lecture for you guys, and then I went to save it and my computer crashed and I lost everything. So that's fun. In any event, we're up and going now. This is one of my favorite weeks because I really enjoy discussing the Federalist Papers. I've spent a lot of my graduate studies on the formation of the Federalist Papers and what they mean in American society now. So let's dive in. We're going to be looking at papers number 52, 57, and 62, and these were written mainly James Madison. 57 was written in collaboration with Alexander Hamilton, and likely 62 as well. So most of this you guys already know. The Federalist Papers were written as a marketing scheme for the proposed Constitution in order to get mainly New York and Virginia to ratify it. 85 essays written to promote the ratification of the Constitution. Usually they were in response to a criticism that they heard from one of the anti-Federalists. They were written under the pseudonym Publius in several New York and Virginia newspapers and magazines. The anti-Federalists' counterpoint to that was Brutus. So they were written again to educate and really influence the voters of New York and Virginia. Those two states were split on how they felt about the Constitution, and if either of those states had voted against it, most likely other states would have followed, and we wouldn't be governed under the Constitution that we have modern day. So Hamilton was the main author of most of the Federalist Papers. He wrote 51, while James Madison wrote 29, and John Jay wrote 5. John Jay actually got sick, so he was unable to contribute as much as Hamilton and Madison. Okay, so diving in. We're looking at Federalist number 52, and it examines the structures of the House of Representatives. This is not in necessarily response to a criticism as much as general inquiries. And so they're looking specifically at the qualifications of the representatives, the frequency of their elections, and those who elect them. Okay? So let me read you this quote about suffrage, because I know that modern day suffrage and the right to vote is very controversial, but at the time it really wasn't. So let's see. The definition of the right of suffrage is very justly regarded as a fundamental article of Republican government. It was incumbent on the convention, therefore, to define and establish this right in the Constitution. To have left it open for the occasional regulation of Congress would have been improper for that reason. To have submitted it to the legislative discretion of the states would have also been improper for that reason. And for the additional reason, it would have been rendered too dependent on state governments. Okay, so the right of suffrage is very justly defined. Okay, they have to allow Congress to occasionally regulate it would be improper. To allow the states discretion to regulate it would also be improper, because it's a fundamental right to the people. But one thing that's important to discuss is this was not a controversial thing necessarily because of the collectivist understanding of America at the time, at the founding. They understood that decisions were made collectively rather than on the individual level. So males voted for the household or for their sect. Religious sects, the same thing. We had more of a collective understanding. So a lot of people will look at the founding and feel disdain for it because they're denying rights of suffrage to women, African Americans, anyone who wasn't a white male, sometimes landowning. But it's difficult to deny something that doesn't necessarily exist yet. And it didn't exist, the idea of having gender or race define who can vote wasn't a thing until almost the 1900s, when America shifted from a collectivist approach to governance to an individualist approach to governance. Okay, and so modern America, it's very controversial because we understand our rights as an individual rather than as a collective unit. So, in Federalist 52, the first thing they discuss is that the qualifications to vote for these representatives in the House is open to whoever wants to vote, or whoever is eligible to vote in the most populous branch of their respective state legislatures. So if it's good enough for the state legislatures, it's good enough for the federal government. So this is brought up first in 52 and then reiterated in Federalist 57, but the qualifications to be your representative are substantially less than one might think. So, for example, they're at the federal level much less defined, and it's easier to make them uniform. A representative must be 25, must be a citizen of the state for 7 years. At the time of his election, he must have lived in the state he represents, and he has to, at the time of his service, hold, or he can't hold any other position. Okay? So the door is open to merit of every description, whether native or adopted, young or old, rich or poor, of any profession. So it doesn't matter if you're rich or you're born in the United States or you're old or you're wealthy. That makes no difference. And that's significant because it's a reflection, again, the House is a reflection of the greater body of society, and it's supposed to maintain a dependency on and sympathy to the people. Okay, and the best way to do that is to ensure that the people are the ones who are actually being elected to those positions. So the second discussion is about the representatives in their terms of office. How often should we elect the House? They asked two questions. First, whether biennial elections or elections every 2 years will be safe. And secondly, whether they are going to be necessary or useful. So this is actually a majority of the paper, the devotion of a majority of the Federalist 52 to the safety, and I'm using air quotes when I say safety, of biennial elections. By safety, he's meaning to protect the liberty from a tyrannical government. And then he's going to go on and use examples from British and Irish and even American history to defend the prudence of electing representatives every 2 years. He asserts that that system will guarantee that representatives remain beholden to the American people first and foremost. Okay, there's no specific evidence guaranteeing that biennial elections are the best protection against the tyrannical government, but he does deduce from historical examples that they must be therefore safe. So, for example, he suggests that if the British liberty could be secured in triennial elections, surely with biennial elections, such as in the Americas, even more liberty would be secured. So let's look into that. So, frequent elections is going to be what ensures that the House remains dependent on and sympathetic to the people. Okay, it is essential to liberty that the government has a common interest with the people. It is particularly essential that the House has an immediate dependence on and intimate sympathy with the people. And so, frequent elections undeniably are the only policy that will effectually secure this dependence and sympathy. However, it's not quite as easy to deduce exactly how often those elections should be calculated. Okay, that's not as easy to do. We know that they need to be frequent, but how frequent? Okay, and so this is where he starts looking at historical examples. Okay, he looks at Great Britain, and he goes through a little bit of British history, saying that with the records that they have, the earliest records show that parliaments were to sit every year, but they weren't elected every year. And so they remedied that, under Charles II, limiting the intermissions to 3 years. And then they eventually made that by statute. So it appears then that Great Britain deciding that 3 years between elections is the shortest period necessary to bind representatives to their constituency in the same way that the House needs to bind their constituency. So if we look at the degree of liberty retained with elections, even every 7 years, as was the first written Great British Constitution, if they were able to get anything out of that, surely they would be able to get liberties secured through biennial elections. And then he goes on, additionally, to discuss Ireland. And Ireland was even worse in that they only had elections if in the event of a vacancy. Up until recently, to the founding, that is, it was changed to every 8 years, which is a very long time. So he moves on with Ireland. He also talks about American history, which I'm not going to spend too much time on, but he makes sure that we understand that we have to keep in mind that these examples aren't exact reflections of the American government, because the federal legislature in America is only going to have part of the legislative authority that is given to the British Parliament. And federal legislatures will also be restrained by its dependence on the people, and state legislatures, which the two examples provided previously were not. And so in that way, even more security and dependence on the people will be ensured through the United States Constitution. If liberty was guaranteed and existed in Great Britain under every 3 years and Ireland under every 8 years, surely every 2 years would provide even more liberty and security against tyrannical government, even more dependence on the people. Okay, so moving on to Federalist number 57. This was directly a collaboration between Madison and Hamilton. And if you read it, the tone of this is much more, they seem a little offended, if anything, by the charges that the House of Representatives is that the members will come from the class of citizens with the least in common, or from society's upper class with the people, who would be more likely, or most likely, to aim at ambitious sacrifices of the many at the expense of the few. So this one is a direct response to a charge that they're only going to come from society's upper half. He even refers to that charge as an imagined oligarchy, and says that it's contrary to the Republican ideals. In fact, at one point, he goes on to have this really kind of, the tone of it is much more angry. Let me read to you this quote. "Let me ask what circumstances there is in the Constitution of the House of Representatives that violates the principles of Republican government, or favors the elevation on the ruins of the many. Let me ask whether every circumstance is not, on the contrary, strictly conformable to these principles and scrupulously impartial to the rights and pretensions of every class and description of citizens." So he's asking, what about the Constitution violates the principles of a Republican government? Basically, it doesn't. Isn't it just the opposite true? Does the Constitution strictly conform to the principles of Republican government? Sorry. I don't know what this is, so I'm just gonna, it says don't show me this, that one. So he finds this charge a little bit superfluous, okay? So he goes on to say then that the first aim of every political constitution is, or at least should be, to find men for rulers who possess the most wisdom and the most virtue to pursue the common good. Next, there have to be effective precautions for keeping them virtuous while they're in the office. So we have to find rulers who are enlightened statesmen with the most virtue and the most wisdom, that they will not be swayed by factions or passions or interests rather than the common good, right? We remember Edmund Burke saying he's not going to be, he'll be your friend, he'll be your representative, but he definitely is not going to be a kiss ass. So, he says, the Constitution as written has effective means for ensuring that both the first and the second quality of the Constitution are upheld, but the most effective is limiting the terms in office. And he dedicates the majority of here to discussing how that is going to be the most effective. So, he then reminds you, who elects these people? Who elects the federal representatives? Not the rich people, not the smart people, not the heirs and the distinguished names and titles of nobility. It's the people. And we should have more faith in the people, the voters of the United States. That will be the same people who have the right to elect representatives to state legislatures. The state legislatures, these are the people who are electing their state representatives, okay? So there won't be more susceptible to tyranny because the states aren't as susceptible. Let me read you this quote. The electors are to be the great body of people of the United States. They are the same who exercise the right in every state of electing the correspondent branch of the legislature. They also say the qualifications for the people in which they are electing don't exist past those articulated in Federalist 52. There is no qualification of wealth. There was no qualification of birth, religious faith, or civil profession. So there's nothing saying that only people of wealth, faith, birth, or religious profession are permitted to. So the people have a vast array of selections that they could choose from of individuals to represent them. Not their judgment is not fettered by qualifications of wealth or birth or religion. Class will not disqualify candidates from being selected. And we need to have more faith in the voters. In fact, he goes on then to say that the voters, we don't have to regulate qualities of the elected because the people will. The men freely elected by their fellow citizens will face every scrutiny that can be devised or desired to ensure the fidelity. The people are going to have to elect these people. They're going to be subject to scrutiny. They will have the qualities that we discussed, virtue and wisdom, because they will have been vetted by the people. Since they will be honored by being the choice, they will presume that they will have to some degree the qualities entitling them to be selected and promise a sincere regard to the nature of their engagements. Okay? The second one is they're entering into a position which will require that they maintain subject to their constituency. As they enter public service, they will have at least temporarily affection for their constituents because they will feel honored and they'll feel grateful for being elected. And so because of their gratefulness, they will provide benevolent returns. Because you elected me, I'm very grateful and honored and humbled that you selected me to represent you, and so in return I will act benevolently in your favor. The second one, or the third one, I think is pretty funny, but true, because we know that politicians are ambitious. In the third place, the ties that bind the representatives to her constituents are strengthened by the selfishness of the representatives. They are prideful. They are vain. They tend to be ambitious. But whatever hopes or plans that they aspire for cannot exist unless they win the vote of their constituency. They would have more hope from a preservation of voters' favor than from governmental interventions that are subversive to the authority of the people. They have more to gain by being good to their people than providing for a government that can become tyrannical or that's subversive to the will of the people. Because they're ambitious, if they someday want to go on to higher office like presidency, they have to keep getting elected. And they have to stay in the favor of the people that elected them. And so because they are selfish and ambitious and prideful, they will then act in accordance with the wishes of the people that they are representing. But if none of these work, none of it will matter without having frequent elections. Okay? All of these securities would be insufficient without the restraint of frequent elections. So in the fourth place, the House is designed to habitually remind the members that their dependence is on the people themselves. Okay? Because they have to anticipate at the ready every 2 years that their power is going to come to an end. And the final one, which I also really enjoy, is that they're also going to live under the laws that they create. Okay, this is a United States that exists under the rule of law, and so there is no law that when fully enacted will not affect them and their families, in addition to the greater society. So if they want to make a tyrannical government, that's fine. Well, it's not fine, but if they do, you still have to live under that system. So try not to do anything too terrible. So Madison is saying here, duty, gratitude, interest, and ambition are the cords which they will be bound to fidelity and sympathy with the great mass of the people. These qualifications are characteristics that ensure the House of Representatives will remain dependent upon the people. So finally is Federalist 62. And Federalist 62, again, was written by Hamilton and Madison, and they're discussing specifically the Senate. And if everyone can recall why we have a Senate, it was a result of a compromise between large states and small states to ensure that there's proper representation. So Hamilton and Madison look at this, and they again they find it a little superfluous. They really are just more of an explanation of reasons that it's necessary to have a Senate. But you'll see, as you read throughout 62, they're saying these things shouldn't be an issue because the large states that are concerned that the Constitution is going to require that they give up some of their power is actually the ones that created this compromise, right? So he goes on, and this is why a lot of people think that this one was actually more authored by Hamilton than Madison, because if you'll notice, there is structural differences in the way that the paper is written. He kind of lists what they're going to be discussing first and foremost, which is not necessarily how the rest of these papers are written. In any event, they say the things they're going to talk about, the qualifications of the senators, the appointment of them by the state legislatures, the equality of representation. He actually says that it's the number of senators and the terms for which they'll be elected, but it's more, he says you can't understand that unless you understand why a Senate is needed in general. And then just at the very end of 62, 63, and 64, he continues to talk about the powers that are vested specifically in the Senate. So, it was understood that the senators are distinguished from those of the representatives, and so based on that higher level of distinction, they have to be more advanced in their age, and they're going to have longer citizenship. Okay? We also know that they sit for longer terms, but we'll get to that in a minute. So, a senator must be at least 35 years of age, whereas a representative must be 25. A senator must have been a citizen for 9 years, rather than the 7 years as required, and that's simply because what he's referring to as senatorial trust requires more information and stability of character, and they feel that the advanced age or reached a period of life most likely to supply that would be 35 by comparison. And because they anticipate there's going to be discussions and transactions with foreign nations, they need to be a citizen of the United States for longer than a representative, because they should be weaned from predispositions and habits that result from being a foreigner and foreign education. They should be removed from foreign traditions and foreign birth, and they should have more of a distinction between the United States and its people. So they actually said that this 9-year decision has been a compromise between the total exclusion of adopted citizens. They don't want to limit the number of people who come from other nations, whose merits and talents may claim share in the public confidence. These are smart people, like particularly Alexander Hamilton. So they don't want to say, well, we have a bunch of really smart foreign people who've been here nearly their whole lives, but they wouldn't be able to serve in the Senate. So in order to make sure that people who are of virtue and of wisdom and of a stable mind and intellect have the ability to serve in that capacity. I'm really sorry if you guys hear my daughter in the background. She's outside playing, and 3-year-olds play much louder than other kids. So he then goes on to say, he actually says that it's unnecessary to dilate on the appointment of senators by the legislatures. He says it's not a matter we shouldn't be discussing. It is unnecessary to discuss the appointment of senators by the state's legislators, specifically because of two things. Of all the ways that the branch of government may have been formed, the method is probably the most consistent with public opinion. The method of selecting senators from state legislatures. There's two advantages. Specifically, the select appointment that gives states a role in forming government, and it links states' authority in the two systems. So the states will be more represented. It gives states a say in forming the federal policy, and forming the federal government, and who makes up the federal government, and it secures the authority of the states in both the state and federal government. Pretty cut and dry, doesn't spend a lot of time talking about it. Then he moves on to the third one of equal representation. Although he spends more time talking about this, he says again, this is a result of a compromise between the large and small states and does not call for a lot of discussion. And then he goes on to talk about two theories of government. When you form a confederation in which the states maintain sovereignty but form a union, you have to have equal representation. But when you have a nation in which they relinquish all their sovereignty, it must be proportional representation. But we know that the United States has neither of these. We have a federal system that has a mixture or a blend between states and federal governments. And so because we have both, we have to have a system of government that ensures representation in both ways. Okay? So here's the quote for that. If indeed it be right that among a people thoroughly incorporated into one nation, every district ought to have a proportional share in the government, and that among the independent and sovereign states, bound together by a simple league, the parties, however unequal in size, ought to have an equal share in common councils. It does not appear to be without some reason that in a compound republic partaking both of the national and federal character, the government ought to be founded on a mixture of these principles of equal and proportional representation. So just like we said, when you have a mixture, you have to have both. He then goes on to say, well, even so, it's silly to evaluate a theory, but a spirit of amity and the mutual difference. We could even evaluate this theory, he says, but it really shouldn't be necessary because it's a compromise, a friendly compromise between large and small states. So this is a direct reflection of that compromise. Nobody should have an issue with it. It's a friendly compromise. Also, having equality in the states creates a block against improper legislative acts. So we know that the House of Representatives may be more prone or subject to factious behavior or impulse or driven more by the people's passion. And so in this way, no law will pass without having both the first and second houses concur in the validity of that law. Okay, so having a house that might be more whimsical than the Senate provides for the Senate to act as a check on that impulsive behavior. Finally, the number of senators and the terms that they will be elected. I would say finally against it actually is just the fourth one. The number of senators and their terms in office are considered, and in order to form an accurate judgment, they have to look at why we have a Senate, and to determine why, you have to look at how would the Republic suffer without having a Senate that looks the way it does. And he goes on to say, look, just part of human nature if and when a legislator forgets their duty to the constituency. Okay, it's a misfortunate part of the Republican government, although to a lesser extent than other governments, that administrators are going to forget their obligations to their constituents. They are going to be unfaithful to their important trust, keeping in mind that there's no way to do anything about that. It's going to happen. It's just a part of it. A Senate as a second house, distinct and divided from the first, will always be a check on that government. It doubles the people's security. It's going to require a concurrence of the two different bodies. So we don't have to worry about ambition in the House because the Senate's there to check it. He then goes on to say single large assemblies tend to work on impulsivity, like the House. It tends to be more impulsive and susceptible to factions and intemperance. So having a stable body of government like the Senate, it will be less numerous and more stable by having longer terms. It will check that passion behavior. They also discuss that because the House only sits for 2 terms, they're also a direct reflection of the people, it's probably going to exist that the people who hold those offices have jobs outside of government or private sector jobs. They'll only sit for short terms. So that means that they're probably not going to be fluent in lawmaking. Okay? The Senate is a stable body, on the other hand. And so these people will sit for longer terms, even longer than the president in some cases. And so they're more versed in the lawmaking legislation, and they need that. Okay? Moreover, if you're going to be dealing with people and foreign governments, you can't have a lot of turnover. Frequent turnover hampers the success of a nation. So it forfeits the respect of the people who elect them. The confidence in government will be lower if you have constantly changing opinions and attitudes about government. And when you have frequent elections, that's exactly what it is, constantly changing things. It discourages business. It threatens liberty to have these constantly changing ideas, especially with regard to foreign nations. They need to have some confidence that in 2 years the government's not going to completely reverse itself. Public instability would be another disadvantage of having frequent changes in attitude. And so we need that stability, and that's the Senate. The Senate is going to be the stable body. They have more virtuous, wise, older, less temperate representatives. They're driven less by passion. They're not directly elected by the people. They sit for longer terms. They are going to be the more stable body. So, like I said before, when you move on to 63, Federalist 63, Federalist 64, and 65, it discusses specific things as with regard to powers vested by the Senate. The advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties with the president, the court acting, the Senate acting as a court in impeachment, things like that. And then it also discusses 6-year terms as well. Things that are very specific to the Senate and why they decided to do that. But we're not going to spend time on it for this class. We don't have a lot of time to, but if you'd like to give those a look, you're free to. I suggest also looking at Federalist Paper number 10, which discusses the ways in which we can check the factious behavior and why we have a representative government and how representative government will help ensure longevity in a large nation. It also, in Federalist 51, discusses separation of powers, which we discussed last week, and is very, very, very influential. So if you have the opportunity, please feel free to read those. I'm going to post as well a Federalist Papers in Modern Language. That might be helpful because I know this is a dense read and some of the terminology is quite outdated. And I've spent a lot of my adult life reading these, and so it's not so difficult for me, but as people who maybe haven't spent as much time on it, it's definitely a challenge. So I'll post that. It should be beneficial. And your quiz is going to be again on due by Sunday night. Let me know if you guys have any questions. I know this was a lot of information for y'all, but I hope it gives you a really good structural foundation of why we have features of our Congress that look the way they do and why they exist in that way. So I will see you guys, or I guess I'll speak with you guys soon.